Right here?
Hi, step here. Step right up.
Step right up. Okay, as you can see, the prosecution has ended its case today. We believe that sufficient evidence has been presented for a holding order to be issued as it relates to murder. The defense will now put on their case, and they will do what they can to reduce the evidence from murder to some other degree, whether it's some degree of manslaughter. But from our point of view, I think that the 4 or 5 videotapes and the related testimony around it clearly indicate unequivocally that there was no basis upon which to use deadly force. There was no basis upon really to use any level of force, such as a taser, even at any point, and that the videotapes show from different perspectives that Oscar, on more than one occasion, was compliant. He was sitting, he had his hands up, and it was really the aggressiveness of the officers, particularly Peroni, that frankly created this whole situation. It is undisputed that if you looked at the various tapes and you heard the testimony, it was the aggressiveness of Officer Peroni in his initial assault on Michael, his verbal profanity, his hostility, his aggressiveness. And then to further illustrate this, he goes over to Oscar, who was then against the platform, and he assaults him in some way. Some say it's a knee, others say it's a punch, but there's no question that it was an assaultive act. And you could see right before that Oscar was not engaged in any kind of physical activities. The tapes show at various points before that he was actually trying to calm the other officers down, the other individuals down. He, in fact, who were making statements to the female officer. But Peroni, for whatever reasons, came over to Oscar, singles him out, and then assaults him, knocking him to the ground. Ultimately, he then leaves, and at some point in time, he says a statement that causes Oscar to get up on his knees, and he's on his knees like this, almost like, what have I done? What have I done? And that's when Mehserle comes out from his side, grabs him, and then he and Peroni take him down. Peroni is over his left shoulder, his neck area is described, and Peroni and Mehserle is at his lower portion of his body, near the leg areas, and he is apparently doing something with one of the arms. And at some point he reaches to his right shoulder, the right area where his holster is, and he fiddles with his gun, and then he pulls it out. And he pulls it out initially, it was down below, then he stands up, he points it at his lower back, and he fires his weapon. There's no doubt that that's going to be a murder holding order. The question then becomes is whether the defense can do something to mitigate against that, to cause the judge to find something less. I think that the evidence, whatever comes in from here on out, is ultimately going to be jury questions. Whether the look on his face was one of surprise, whether it was one of, oh God, that doesn't go to the question of whether or not he did the conduct. That might go something for a jury to consider at some later point. And so from our point of view, the evidence has been clearly set forth now at this stage to justify a holding order, and that if the case were to end today, there would be no doubt that it would occur. So now it's really up to the defense to put forth evidence to try to convince the judge that something less than murder should be held. He should be held. It is not an accidental shooting. It is going to be held to answer on a homicide charge. And so the defense will now seek to do what they can to mitigate against the murder. Now, what the defense has argued in a public way, and I've said this before, that he intended to go for his taser. I will tell you that there is no evidence, and I will ask each of you to look to see if at any point in time Mehserle tells anyone that he was reaching for his taser. And I know that there's no evidence to that effect, certainly not on that night, that morning, or any time in and around that. So without that, then there's no basis to get into his head as to what he intended to do. That ultimately would be a jury question at some later point.
Did you learn anything new from seeing this Tommy Cross video that's not been out there?
No, we did not. Tommy Cross's video essentially supports my view of this case from the very beginning. I had met with all of these young men, not him, shortly thereafter the event. I had the videotapes shortly thereafter. This was just another version. It did not offer anything new. At various points it was clearer. But I think more importantly what it does give you in terms of if there's any freshness to it is that it clearly suggests that the chaotic scene that occurred that's on the various tapes only occurred after the police officers were very aggressive toward the young men, and the people on the train was expressing their outrage as to what they were seeing. So essentially what you have is the police creating this emotional hostility from the crowd, and you heard them yelling and screaming and in many ways in protesting. So that tape offers an illustration. If one had to sequence the events, there was no indication of riotous conduct when the officers got there. There was no indication of boisterous. If you look on the various platforms, the pictures on the platforms, you don't see fighting, you don't see aggressiveness, you don't see physical force, and you don't hear loud talking. That only occurs after Peroni is aggressive toward Michael, and then after that, people saw what they were doing to the young men against the platform, and ultimately seeing that they were doing to Oscar, and they became outraged by that.
But we do hear there was a fight, and that Oscar was involved in a fight.
You heard? There's never been any dispute that he was on a train, but I have to tell you, that in and of itself does not justify any of the conduct that occurred, because at the time the officer came in contact with Oscar, he was not fighting. He in fact had been cooperative. He had been trying to explain, he had tried to prevent others from it. So whatever occurred before, and obviously something happened on that train, but by the time the officers got to the train, nothing was going on of any kind of boisterous or outrageous nature. The officers certainly had a right to conduct their own investigation. They had a right to find out what had happened, but they certainly didn't have a right to just arbitrarily accuse individuals without having any fact pattern, because no one had been identified, and number two, there wasn't any basis upon which they could argue that they were going to arrest them. At best, what you have going is Peroni responding to Michael, to Oscar and others, talking to the officers, and then from there he initiates aggressive conduct. So all of that has to be evaluated in the context. I think those are jury questions that ultimately will be determinative, and what you have is essentially Mehserle coming up